Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for a deep dive into a story that's become kind of legendary.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I mean, when people talk about, government power and individual rights, this one always seems to come up.
Yeah, for sure.
Ruby Ridge. A standoff back in '92. Up in the mountains of Idaho?
Yep.
You might have heard about it, but we're going deep today. Using court transcripts, investigative reports,
Wow.
even first-hand accounts to really understand it. This family living off the grid, how'd they end up in a deadly confrontation with federal agents?
Wild, right?
Totally. And what's so interesting is how Ruby Ridge, it's not just history, it still matters today. We're still debating law enforcement tactics
Definitely.
and how easily things can go wrong. I mean, even with what seemed like minor charges.
You're absolutely right. It's a case study in that balance.
Yeah.
Individual freedoms versus government authority.
Exactly. A balance we're still figuring out even today. So first, let's meet the family at the heart of this. Randy and Vicki Weaver. Who were they? What brought them to this isolated life on Ruby Ridge?
Well, Randy, he was an ex-factory worker, Army veteran.
Okay.
Vicky, she had some strong apocalyptic beliefs. They wanted a self-sufficient life, feeling disillusioned with society.
I see, yeah.
So in the 80s, they're drawn to Ruby Ridge. Isolation, the beauty of it, built their own cabin, raised their 4 kids.
Far from the mainstream.
Exactly.
Okay, so they're off the grid deliberately,
Yeah.
but then the ATF comes knocking. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Why were they interested in the Weavers?
It all starts with a meeting, the World Aryan Congress, a gathering of, well, white supremacists.
Right.
The ATF was investigating the Aryan nations, known for their extremist views. They had an informant who met Randy at this meeting.
Got it.
Now, important to note, Weaver went to a few meetings, but sources suggest he wasn't actually a member of the Aryan nations.
Okay, so that's a key distinction.
Absolutely.
But this meeting, it ultimately led to charges against Randy, right?
Yeah. The ATF informant claimed Randy sold him illegal sawed-off shotguns. They tried to use the charges, to pressure Weaver into becoming an informant against the Aryan nations.
Oh, wow.
But Weaver refused, saw it as betraying his principles.
So they went ahead with the charges.
Yeah.
But there's a twist, isn't there? Some issues with the info they were using against Weaver.
There were. The ATF claimed Weaver was dangerous, said he was a bank robber, had prior convictions.
Well,
Completely false. A Senate investigation later confirmed no criminal record at all.
whoa, hold on.
Yeah. Raises serious questions about the information they used to build a case against him.
That's a big misstep.
It is.
Then things get even more complicated. Weaver misses a court date. This is where the U.S. Marshals Service comes in, the USMS.
Right. Tasked with apprehending fugitives.
Exactly. What happened there?
A lot of confusion around the court date. Weaver was initially told February 19th, but it was changed to the 20th.
Okay.
Court sent notices, but seems they went to his lawyer, not directly to him.
I see.
And get this, his probation officer sent a letter, but with the wrong date, March 20th.
So even with attempts to notify him, there's room for miscommunication.
Huge room for it.
And how did Weaver react to all of this?
He got suspicious, increasingly so, believed there was a conspiracy against him.
Right.
And despite being told about the date errors, the judge wouldn't withdraw the bench warrant for Weaver's arrest.
So you have this family, already distrustful, facing what they see as hostile actions. And the USMS has to bring Randy in. What was their initial approach?
Well, they tried to de-escalate, actually. Aware of Weaver's distrust, opted for a cautious approach.
Interesting.
Tried negotiating through third parties, even considered waiting it out, hoping he'd come down on his own.
Trying to avoid confrontation.
Yeah, but then there's this threat source profile created for Weaver.
What is that exactly? How did it affect things?
It's a document used by law enforcement to assess the potential danger of an individual. It's supposed to inform their approach, help them make decisions. But in Weaver's case, the profile had a lot of inaccuracies, exaggerations.
Like what?
It claimed Weaver was ex-Green Beret, trained in demolitions, huge threat to law enforcement. Reality was very different. His military experience wasn't that extensive. The profile made him seem way more dangerous than he was. And this is key. This flawed profile really escalated things.
I see. So they're working with bad information. And then there's that bizarre incident with the Geraldo Rivera helicopter, right? Didn't that add fuel to the fire?
Oh, absolutely. That incident, it's a perfect example of how media can influence things, even law enforcement.
How so?
So a helicopter, hired for Geraldo's show, flies over the Weaver property. Initial reports, which turn out to be false, claimed Weaver fired shots at it.
Wait, so those reports were wrong?
Totally. Even the pilot denied any shots were fired. But the story, it created this climate of fear despite being false. And sadly, law enforcement was already primed to believe the worst about Weaver.
So you have this perfect storm brewing, a distrustful family, a bad threat source profile, and then this media frenzy. Things are about to take a very dark turn. What happened next?
August 21st. A team of 6 U.S. Marshals, they were sent to scout the area around the Weaver cabin.
Oh,
Their goal, find a good spot for a potential arrest.
makes sense.
Ideally avoiding a confrontation right there at the cabin, dressed in camo, armed with M16 rifles.
So trying to be tactical, but this mission, it's where things really went south, right?
Yeah, during this scout, they ran into the Weaver family dog, Stryker.
Oh, no.
One of the marshals shot and killed the dog,
Oh,
which understandably provoked a reaction from Weaver's son Samuel, he was 14, and their friend Kevin Harris, they were nearby.
that's heartbreaking. I can only imagine what that was like for them. So young, so sudden.
Absolutely. Samuel yelled at the marshals, and a shot was fired.
Man.
It all spiraled from there, a chaotic firefight. In the confusion, a U.S. Marshal, William Deegan, was killed, and so was young Samuel Weaver. Tragic. Such a tragedy. And still so much debate about who fired first.
Exactly. The exact details are still disputed to this day.
Right. But the outcome was devastating. And it changed everything.
It did.
This wasn't about a fugitive anymore. It was a full-blown siege now.
You're right. Hundreds of federal agents, including the FBI's hostage rescue team, the HRT, descended on Ruby Ridge.
Wow.
What started small-scale became national news, media everywhere covering it.
And the rules of engagement come into play here. The ROEs. Can you explain what those are, for those of us not in law enforcement?
Sure. Think of ROEs as the guidelines for how and when officers can use force,
Okay.
especially deadly force.
Yeah.
They're crucial to make sure actions are appropriate to the threat.
Right. Keeps things from escalating unnecessarily.
Exactly. So what were the specific ROEs for Ruby Ridge?
Yeah. And how did they affect the standoff?
Well, they were very controversial. Later deemed unconstitutional, actually. The ROE in place at the time allowed agents to use deadly force on any armed adult male seen around the cabin.
Hold on. Any. So not just Randy Weaver. No. It was very broad. Raised serious concerns about excessive force. And remember, this ROE was set before any serious negotiation attempts with Weaver.
So basically a shoot-on-sight order if they saw a man with a gun.
That's how many saw it. Even some within the FBI were shocked. They saw it as a dangerous departure from the norm.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
And sadly, it led to another awful incident. FBI sniper Lon Horiuchi. What happened there?
Second day of the siege, Horiuchi, positioned over 200 yards away, he fired 2 shots. First one hit Randy Weaver in the back.
Oh,
Weaver was checking on the shed where his son's body was.
oh God.
Second shot fired as Weaver, his daughter Sarah, and Kevin Harris ran back to the cabin. That shot hit and killed Vicki Weaver.
Oh my God.
She was behind the cabin door holding her baby daughter.
That's just unimaginable.
The Justice Department's own task force later said that second shot was unconstitutional. No imminent threat, no attempt to request surrender before Horiuchi fired.
So you have this already tense standoff, made worse by these ROEs, and it results in Vicki Weaver's death. How did this siege finally end?
It went on for 11 days, agonizing. It wasn't until a civilian negotiator, Bo Gritz, got involved that things shifted.
Bo Gritz, wasn't he a Vietnam vet?
He was. Well known in anti-government circles. He got through to Weaver, convinced him to surrender.
So Gritz was key to ending it peacefully.
Very much so. Kevin Harris, wounded in the initial firefight, he surrendered first, flown to a hospital. Then, with Gritz's help, Randy Weaver came down, agreed to face the charges.
Wow. But even though the siege ended, the story doesn't, right? What about the investigations into how the government handled it all?
There was outrage. People wanted answers.
Rightfully so.
Led to multiple investigations. The Justice Department had their own task force, then a Senate subcommittee.
What did they find?
Both reports were very critical. They said those ROEs not only unconstitutional, but they escalated the situation.
As we've discussed.
They questioned the use of deadly force, especially with Vicki Weaver's death, and they pointed out flaws in the FBI's decisions. Bad communication, poor planning, not focusing on de-escalation.
So mistakes were made.
Absolutely.
What about Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris, their trials? What happened legally?
Both were charged with a lot of offenses, including murder.
Wow.
But after a long trial, Randy Weaver was acquitted of everything except failing to appear for that original court date on the firearms charge.
So a very minor charge in the end.
Yes. He served less than 16 months.
And Kevin Harris.
Acquitted of everything, too. Later, he was indicted on state murder charges for Marshall Deegan's death.
Oh, wow.
But that case was dismissed, double jeopardy, can't be tried twice for the same crime.
Right, so both men cleared of the most serious charges.
Yeah.
But the legal battles didn't stop there, did they? The civil lawsuits.
Nope. The Weavers sued the government for wrongful death. For Samuel and Vicky's deaths, they got a $3.1 million settlement.
So a big payout. But did the government admit they did anything wrong?
No. Despite the settlement, they didn't admit any wrongdoing.
What about Kevin Harris?
He sued too. Ended up with a $380,000 settlement. It's interesting. Federal officials initially said they'd never compensate someone who killed a U.S. Marshal.
Really?
Yeah. But the evidence in Harris's case and those government investigations showed that Ruby Ridge was way more complex than the initial story.
Right. It brings up the question of accountability.
Mm.
We have these investigations showing serious flaws, big settlements paid out. But did any of the agents face consequences? What about Lon Horiuchi, the sniper?
That's a question a lot of people ask. Horiuchi was indicted for manslaughter in '97 by a local prosecutor,
Okay.
but the case got moved to federal court, then dismissed. Sovereign immunity protects government employees from certain lawsuits.
So despite everything, no one was held accountable.
That's right. And that lack of accountability made the public angrier, eroded trust in the government, especially for those already skeptical.
Understandable. Makes sense.
Ruby Ridge became a rallying cry for anti-government groups, strengthened the idea of government overreach, and what can happen when law enforcement is too aggressive, working with bad information.
Ruby Ridge had a huge ripple effect.
It did.
Went way beyond Idaho, tapped into those anxieties about freedom and government power.
Absolutely. A chilling reminder of how fear and anger can be used.
And it didn't just inspire talk. It affected some people who went down a path of extremism.
Sadly, yes.
Which brings us to Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, Oklahoma City bombing, 1995.
Right.
They said Ruby Ridge was part of why they did it.
A devastating example of how Ruby Ridge contributed to that climate of violence, extremism. That bombing, 168 people killed.
Including 19 children.
A real wake-up call. Made the nation confront the dangers of anti-government sentiment.
Hard to even comprehend that tragedy. So looking back on our deep dive into Ruby Ridge, what are the key takeaways? What have we learned?
For me, it shows how crucial responsible law enforcement is and how important it is to protect individual rights. It's a warning about bad information, about needing clear rules of engagement.
Right, those ROs.
And the need to de-escalate, especially in these tense situations.
You've mentioned misinformation a few times. Do you see connections between the media back then and the way misinformation spreads today?
That's a good question. The media landscape is totally different now. Internet, social media, but there are parallels. Inaccurate information spread quickly then, and it still does now, shapes how people see things.
It does.
Shows how important critical thinking is. Media literacy, finding good sources of information.
That's when the stakes are high.
Exactly. Ruby Ridge changed how people saw the government, fueled a movement that's still around today.
And it asks those big questions about security versus liberty. Still debated today, right?
Yeah.
How do we protect ourselves from threats, real or imagined, without losing our freedoms?
Tough questions. No easy answers. But Ruby Ridge shows that the stakes are huge. Ignoring these questions, not learning from the past, can lead to terrible outcomes.
It's a story that just won't go away. Maybe because it touches on something very human, the desire for freedom, the fear of being controlled, finding that balance between individual rights and keeping everyone safe.
You said it. It makes us think about the role of government, using force and accountability. Even in a democracy, power needs to be used carefully with respect for individual rights.
This has been a fascinating look at a complicated event, and it's still relevant today. For our listeners who want to learn more, we have resources in the show notes. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.